It's Andre from the High Performance Academy, and we're here at World Time Attack 2016 with Alan from Gibson Motorsport. Now, the car behind me is one of my personal favourites. It's the original R32 GTR that won Bathurst in 1991 with Mark Skaife and Jim Richards on board. Now, this is probably one of the cars, at least on this side of the world, that really started the love affair for the GTR, or Godzilla as it became known. Now, Alan, it's not often we get a chance to get some insight into the technical background on such an iconic car. Back in 1991, you were running the Gibson Motorsport program and actually developed the GTR from the ground up. And while these days, I guess we see any number of R32 GTRs producing 600, 700, 800 horsepower, back then it was you guys that were really leading the way and developing the cars. What sort of challenges does that give you when you have no prior knowledge of the engine and the chassis?
Look, I mean, the biggest issue we had then was regulations. I mean, it was under Group A, and you were limited with what you could do. You just couldn't go and change everything and sundry type thing. It had to be homologated, it had to be sort of approved, and all those sorts of things. So that created a lot of restriction. But yeah, look, I mean, you take the basic principles for building the race car, and you try to apply them. And then when you've got an obstacle, you try and go around it, as simple as that. But look, the car itself, for its time, with its four-wheel drive and four-wheel steer and all that sort of stuff, was a bit of a challenge for us. But, you know, as we went down the road and tried different things, we found that we could simplify a lot of things with the car, and we maintained the four-wheel drive system that was standard with the GTR. We did do away with the rear steer because that didn't function very well with race tyres. And we tapped into the standard electronic four-wheel drive system of the Nissan system, and created a control box of our own, which gives us variation. We could actually sort of put standard four-wheel drive. We could give it more to the front, more if we wanted to, from up to 4, and we could actually disconnect the front a certain time for starts and things like that, so that we didn't have four-wheel drives trying to get off the line.
How was the driver making use of that four-wheel drive adjustment? Is it purely on a dry track versus a wet track, or was it also dependent on whether the track was a fast track or a tight, twisty track?
Well, look, it totally depended on the driver's feel. If it was a wet track, yeah, you'd chuck more four-wheel drive into the thing, but that's totally at the driver's choice type thing. But the other thing too was that as you're out there in, let's say, a long stint and a tyre that's a track that's a bit aggressive on tyres, then I mean, as your front tyres start to go away or your rears do, then you feed some more front drive on, which takes a bit of load off the rear tyres, and it's just all that sort of balancing act that you've got.
In terms of the engine power, from what I understand, these engines were up to close to 700 horsepower at one point. What sort of boost pressure were you using to produce that?
Look, about 1.8 was maximum, and yeah, on a good day on the dyno, I think we saw about just under 700 horsepower, 699 I think was the best one we ever got, but we raced them at 680, and that was around about 1.6, 1.7 bar boost, and then if it was a really long race, we'd drop it back to 1.4 and all that sort of area to keep reliability into it. And
is that another thing that the driver had control of in the cabin? They could adjust the boost on the fly?
No.
I imagine there would be a tendency there if the driver was behind someone, might be pushing a little bit too much boost for too long?
There was a boost control system in the car, but the driver never had access to it. It was all preset based on what was required at the time. Yeah.
In terms of getting reliability out of the RB26 at that sort of power level, and I mean, I've commented on guys running street cars now at 700, 800 horsepower, it's fairly normal. There's one thing doing it for in a street car, it's completely different doing it for a 1,000-kilometre endurance race. What challenges did you face in getting reliability in these engines? Again, you were breaking new ground, and you couldn't look at what other people were doing to build a GTR engine.
Look, I mean, Nismo had homologated a reasonably good conrod and piston and crank and all that type thing, so that was all right. But the issue was with higher boost was cylinder pressure seal, and we tried to do ring development and then trying to get the oil out at the top of the engine. So there was all sorts of work done on the heads to try and reduce oil flow to the top, but keep enough there so it's so reliable. And on average, we run an engine to the death one stage, and it did 2,600 racing kilometres before it failed, and it broke a big end bolt. So we knew then we'd bring them back to 2,000 k's and had a safe, reliable engine and replace the big end bolts regularly.
I guess that's one way to learn the hard way, I guess, what is going to fail. Just looking at the technology involved in this car, and I mean, 1990, 1991 when the cars were developed, we've obviously come a long way in terms of, in particular, the engine management technology. Back when you were developing these cars and tuning them, was the engine management that you had access to, would you consider that held you back, or was it not a problem?
No, look, I think it was more than capable of handling what we could do. I mean, I think if anything, it was probably our understanding of it to a higher degree was probably more of where we get more benefit from it. But, you know, we had plenty of power. And you know, back those days, I mean, the cylinder heads, gasket sealing was a real issue. I mean, gaskets aren't what they are today. And, you know, we developed a ring setup so that the cylinder was sealed with a ring, and it was all that sort of thing, so to take the combustion pressure and the temperature and you know, keeping the temperatures under control. And we actually did our own turbochargers because, again, the standard ones and what we're putting them to just wouldn't hack the pace. So we did our own crank turbocharger bearings and thrust washers and all that sort of stuff, which is all, and balance them ourselves and all that type of thing. So it just gave us that edge to be able to find where the limits were and then look at it and say, can we improve this? And it was all done in-house. There was no outside influence by anybody to develop the car at all. It was all the blokes we had on the floor and the blokes in the engineering that sort of made it all happen.
I guess bringing that all in-house as well, having total control over it, you know exactly what's going on, and you can work to a stricter timeline than relying on other people. Now, as the car proved to be incredibly successful in motorsport, obviously it was faster than a lot of the cars it was competing against, and I understand that some structures were put in place to reduce the power of the car and make competitive with the rest of the pack. Now, what was done to the car, and how did you cope with that?
Well, I mean, when we had the boost restriction put on us back to sort of 1.3 and rather than 1.8, that type of thing, well, the guys had to sort of get their thinking hat on and say, right, how can we get our power back? And they did. They individually tuned each cylinder, so they got maximum performance out of each cylinder, and then combined with all six doing everything they're supposed to be doing, we went from about 570 horsepower back to 640, 645. That's all.
So just to go back into that in a little bit more detail, so the boost limit was imposed down to that 1.3 bar, and from what I understand, that was done by way of a sort of a pop-off valve on the plenum.
Yep, correct. It was a pop-off valve. Yep.
Now you said that took you from 670 horsepower down to about 570, or 680 down to about 570. So you were down about 100 horsepower based on that lower boost pressure, and you've got a lot of that back via this individual cylinder tuning. So I just want to get into that in a little bit more detail. Can you explain how that was done?
Well, the guys sort of logged the crankshaft rotation based on picking up a pickup sensor on that picked up the teeth of the flywheel, and then made up a package that then sensed they had pressure transducers on the spark plugs. So the combination of putting that information together, they were able to then look at a system where they could dial the engine, tune the engine to maximum cylinder pressure at 250 RPM increments on each cylinder. And that in itself, I mean, it was a lot more complicated than that, but I mean, they finally got around where they had each cylinder doing exactly what it was supposed to be doing, and that then they picked up 90 odd horsepower again. So it was, I mean, brilliant people. They just did a marvellous job. Yeah.
It's a pretty good indication of when you've got some smart people with their thinking hats on. It's easy sometimes to find, well, not easy, but it's possible to find ways around those rules and get back to where you were. Look, it's obviously an impressive car. As I've said, it's iconic, and it's really spawned a huge number of followers out there in that tuning market. So really been great to get some more insight into the development of that car back in those times. Thanks for giving us that insight and talking to us today, Alan.
No, not a problem at all. Thank you very much for asking. Yeah, happy to share the information.